Cherry petals drifted through the Wyoming wind that spring, soft as ashes from a memory that refused to fade. They fell over the cracked teacup outside the Lee family's cabin, where Lee Malin sat sewing beside the open door, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hand steady though her heart had long trembled. The scent of wet earth and new grass filled the air. Inside, her daughter, Cindy, 19, hummed softly in Mandarin as she arranged their few belongings: porcelain bowls wrapped in linen, an old paper fan, the silk scraps of their past life in Guangdong. The wind shifted, carrying the distant laughter of townsfolk down the valley, and Malin's mouth hardened. She spoke the words that would mark the year forever: "No one marries my Chinese daughter." The statement was not bitterness, it was armor. She had heard the whispers at the mercantile, the laughter behind lace-gloved hands. "Pretty but not for marrying," they said. "Not our kind." The town had never forgiven them for surviving where others had starved. A widow and her foreign daughter, quiet as ghosts. Every kindness they offered was treated as oddity, every smile as invitation for mockery. Cindy stepped into the sunlight, her long black braid gleaming, her eyes the calm of river stones. "Mother," she said gently, "the flowers bloomed early." She held a branch of cherry blossoms, pale pink against her tanned fingers. Malin turned away from their fragile beauty. "Beauty invites trouble," she murmured. "Hide it, child." Down the dusty road, a wagon rattled. A young man drove it, tall and broad-shouldered beneath his worn coat. Eli Boone, rancher of the northern range, known for few words and a gaze that saw more than he spoke. He halted near the cabin, the reins creaking. "Morning, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Brought feed from Miller's store. Figured you might be short." Malin's back stiffened. "We pay our debts." "Didn't ask for pay," he said simply. His voice was gentle but carried weight, like thunder far off. Cindy appeared beside her mother, half hiding behind the doorframe. Eli's eyes flicked toward her, curiosity not claim, and lingered for a heartbeat too long. The girl lowered her gaze. He nodded once and began unloading the sack of feed by their fence. Malin felt her heart twist with an old fear. She had seen that look before, on miners, on drifters, men who thought kindness earned them something. Yet this man's manner was different. He moved slowly, respectful, as if their small world were made of porcelain too fragile to touch. When he left, Malin stood in the doorway, watching his wagon vanish into the gold horizon. "You'll keep your distance from him," she told Cindy. "The town already talks." Cindy's voice was soft. "He was kind, mother." "Kindness costs," Malin snapped, but her tone faltered halfway. She knew the truth of her words, and it tasted of loneliness. That evening, thunder rolled in from the west. The valley filled with the scent of rain, heavy and metallic. Malin hurried to bring in her sewing, but the wind tore the fabric from her hands. Cindy laughed as she chased the flying scraps, her bare feet sinking in mud. For a moment, she looked like the girl she had been before America, barefoot, unburdened, radiant. Malin's heart clenched at the sight. She wanted to protect that innocence even if it meant building walls around it. Rain lashed against the cabin. The roof leaked. Malin placed buckets beneath the drips, muttering prayers to ancestors she wasn't sure could hear her anymore. Then above the storm's roar came the sound of hooves. Eli's wagon appeared through the curtain of rain. He jumped down, his coat soaked, eyes scanning the sagging porch. "You'll drown in here," he said, pushing open the door without waiting for permission. "Barn's empty, come take shelter." Malin bristled. "We manage fine." "Doesn't look it." He glanced up at the ceiling where water streamed through broken shingles. "Come on now." Cindy hesitated, torn between fear and gratitude. "Mama?" "No," Malin said. "We're not beggars." Lightning flashed, illuminating Eli's expression. Not pity but quiet resolve. "Wasn't offering charity," he said. "Offering shelter. There's a difference." For a long moment, the three stood suspended in the hiss of rain. Then Malin nodded, once the gesture barely visible. He helped them gather what little they owned. They followed him to his barn, where the air smelled of hay and horses. The storm rattled the roof, but inside the space felt safe. Cindy spread their blankets near the corner, arranging the teacup and a lantern as if to make a home from nothing. Malin sat apart, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Why do you help us?" she asked. Eli shrugged. "Because you're human. Because the rain don't care who you are." Something in those words loosened a knot deep within her, though she would not admit it. When he left them for the night, the door creaked shut behind him and silence settled like snowfall. Later, when the storm eased, Malin heard her daughter whispering a prayer in the dark, half Chinese, half English. He is different, Cindy said. Like someone who listens even when no one speaks. Mayline's eyes filled, though she did not cry. She knew too well how fragile hope could be. By dawn the rain had stopped. Mist drifted through the meadow, soft as breath. Cindy stepped outside to hang their clothes on the fence. Eli was already in the field, checking his horses. Their eyes met across the distance. A pause, a small smile, almost shy. From the road above, voices echoed. Two men on horseback, laughing. "Look at that, Boone's taking in Chinamen now," one jeered. The words sliced the morning open. Eli's face hardened, but he didn't shout back. He simply tipped his hat to Cindy as if to tell her not to be ashamed. She lowered her head, pretending not to hear. But Maylin, watching from the doorway, did hear, and the old armor around her heart thickened again. That night, back in their rebuilt cabin, she repeated her vow, "No one marries my Chinese daughter." Cindy didn't answer. She only looked through the window toward the far ridge, where a lantern flickered in the Boone Ranch house. Rainwater still dripped from the eaves, but the scent of spring clung to the air, wildflowers, wet soil, and something else she couldn't yet name. Outside, the cherry trees shivered in the moonlight. A single petal floated down, landing on the cracked teacup. Maylin lifted it absently, staring at the faint reflection of her own face in the rainwater pooled inside. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote howled, a long, lonely sound that carried through the valley like a memory refusing to rest. And though she whispered again that her daughter would never wed in this land, a tremor passed through her voice. Because in her heart, she feared the truth she would not speak, that spring had come uninvited, and with it, the first stirring of change. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the world washed and trembling. Steam rose from the earth in thin white ribbons, and the valley smelled of wet sage and iron. Eli Boone leaned against his fence post, hat low, watching the morning settle. His horses stamped softly, restless in the silence after the storm. In the distance, smoke curled from the Lee family's chimney, thin, hesitant. He wondered if they'd slept at all in the barn, or if the sound of rain on tin had kept them awake as it had him. By mid-morning, he rode down with a plank of dry wood balanced across his saddle. The Lee porch sagged from years of wind and rain, its boards warped and weary. Maylin stood by the doorway, her sleeves rolled up, wringing out a wet quilt. Her dark hair clung to her neck. When she saw him, she tensed, her hands freezing mid-motion. "You came again," she said flatly. Eli nodded once. "Your roof's still leaking. Figured I'd mend it before the next storm." "We didn't ask," Maylin said. "Didn't say you did." The exchange hung in the air, taut as wire. Then Cindy appeared behind her mother, barefoot, carrying a cracked clay pot filled with the rainwater she'd gathered. Her eyes met his, briefly, shyly, and something unspoken passed between them, like the faint warmth that lingers after lightning. He worked in silence, his hammer steady, his boots leaving deep prints in the damp soil. Cindy hovered near the porch, pretending to sweep puddles but stealing glances upward. Each strike of his hammer sounded like defiance, echoing through the open air. Maylin watched from the threshold, arms folded as if daring him to finish. By afternoon, the sky had cleared entirely. The clouds broke apart, revealing blue so pure it hurt to look at. Eli straightened, wiping sweat and sawdust from his brow. "That should hold," he said quietly. Maylin's lips pressed thin. "You could have sent one of your men. Didn't trust them to do it right." He turned to leave, but Cindy darted forward. "Wait." She disappeared inside, then returned holding a small cup of jasmine tea. "For thanks," she said, her English careful but certain. Eli hesitated, then accepted it. The tea was delicate, steam curling up in the breeze, scenting the air with flowers. "Much obliged," he said, voice roughened by surprise. He handed the cup back gently, their fingers brushing for an instant, barely contact, yet enough to startle them both. After he rode away, Maylin scolded her daughter. "Do not offer gifts to men," she said. "They see kindness as promise." Cindy's voice trembled, but her eyes did not drop. "Maybe not all men." The words lingered longer than the scent of jasmine. That night, gossip reached the edge of town like fire on dry grass. Mrs. Hawthorne, who ran the church sewing circle, whispered that Eli Boone had taken those foreigners into his barn. Men at the saloon laughed, calling him soft, bewitched. In a land that measured worth by pride and skin, mercy was the one act that earned scorn. Eli heard it all. He said nothing. When Tom Bray, his nearest neighbor, joked, "You fixing to marry into China now?" Eli's reply was calm, "Fixing to mind my own." The next morning he found a piece of embroidered cloth tied to his saddle horn, a white handkerchief stitched with red plum blossoms. The thread was uneven, shy. He tucked it into his coat pocket and said nothing. Days passed and spring deepened. The valley turned green again, the river running clear as glass. Cindy began helping at the Boone Ranch, mending feed sacks and tending the colts. Eli's men, rough as rawhide, watched with uneasy curiosity at first. She moved quietly among them, bowing her head in greeting, speaking only when needed. Her grace disarmed even the most skeptical. One noon, when a colt broke free and bolted, Cindy ran after it barefoot through the field. Eli followed, but she reached the animal first, whispering in Mandarin until it calmed. The men stared, impressed and bewildered. Eli only smiled, shaking his head. "You've got away with the stubborn ones," he said softly. She blushed, her hair clinging to her cheeks. "Maybe I understand them." That evening, Malin arrived to fetch her daughter. Her face was tight with pride and fear. "You are not a ranch hand," she hissed in their language. "These people will never see you as equal." "I am not trying to be equal," Cindy whispered. "I am trying to be useful." Malin's anger broke into sorrow. "Usefulness will not protect you, my child." Rain threatened again that night. The wind carried the scent of iron and grass. Malin lay awake, listening to her daughter breathe beside her, remembering the ship that had brought them across the ocean, how men had stared at their bound feet and whispered. She had crossed an ocean to give Cindy a chance at dignity. And yet here, in this new world, she still had to guard her from kindness itself. At dawn, Eli returned to the cabin with a small wooden box. He set it on their porch without a word. When Cindy opened it, she found seed packets, tomatoes, beans, wildflowers, and a folded note, for when the rain pauses. She pressed the note to her heart, her fingers trembling. Malin saw and said nothing. For once, she could not summon anger, only the quiet ache of gratitude she dared not express. Over the next days, the seeds took root in the narrow strip of earth outside their cabin. Green shoots rose where mud had been, fragile yet determined. Eli passed by on horseback sometimes, tipping his hat but never stopping. Cindy watched him until he vanished each time, her heart fluttering like the leaves he left behind. One afternoon, the two women walked into town. The chatter stopped as they entered the general store. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice cut through the silence. "Well, if it isn't Boone's ladies," she said, smirking. "He must be charitable this spring." The words struck like stones. Malin stood frozen, her pride bleeding beneath her composure. Cindy lowered her eyes, shame burning her throat. Before Malin could answer, Eli stepped through the door behind them, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Ma'am," he said to Mrs. Hawthorne, his tone level, "these women are my neighbors. Show them respect." Gasps rippled through the room. No one spoke. Mrs. Hawthorne flushed, her mouth twisting, but she said nothing. Eli paid for their goods, tipped his hat, and left as quietly as he'd entered. Cindy followed his retreating figure through the window until it blurred into sunlight. That evening, Malin sat on the porch watching her daughter water the seedlings. The world had softened, the rain gone, the air gentle again. Eli's words had not erased the gossip, but they had drawn a line between cruelty and decency. Malin whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "He shamed them for us." In the distance, thunder murmured again, but this time it sounded less like warning and more like promise. Cindy looked up from her garden, her face lit by the glow of sunset. And for the first time, Malin didn't tell her to hide her beauty. Somewhere beyond the hills, Eli rode home through fields glistening with dew, unaware that the handkerchief in his pocket had slipped out and fluttered to the ground, landing among the new green leaves, where the rain had paused and spring began to bloom again. Rumors grow best under sunlight, and by midsummer the valley was burning bright. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the scent of clover drifted through the wind. Eli Boone's ranch stood at the heart of it all, steady, open, unguarded, and yet his kindness toward the Lee women had turned into the town's favorite story. They said the widower had gone soft. They said the foreign girl had bewitched him. They said 100 other things, none of them true, and every whisper carried just far enough to be heard where it hurt most. Cindy felt it first in the silences, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, how glances slid over her like she wasn't supposed to exist. Yet each morning she still walked the half-mile to Eli's ranch, her sleeves rolled up, her face calm, her braids swinging behind her like a dark ribbon of resolve. Eli pretended not to notice the stares that followed her, though his jaw hardened each time. He told his men to keep their distance, to mind their words. Most did, out of respect or fear of his temper, but the gossip still found cracks to crawl through. One noon, as the men rested beneath the cottonwoods, Tom Bray muttered, "She's got him wrapped tighter than a lasso on a calf." Eli's hammer stopped mid-swing. "Say that again," he said. The tone wasn't loud, but the men went still. Tom met his eyes and looked away. The hammer struck again, sharp and final. After that, no one spoke her name within earshot of him. But gossip is a weed, cut it down and it grows sideways. Soon it reached Maylin. She arrived at the ranch one evening, her steps fast, her shawl trailing dust. "You will ruin her," she said in their language, voice trembling between fury and grief. "Your pity will brand her worse than cruelty ever could." Eli removed his gloves slowly. "Ain't pity," he said. "Just decency." "Decency does not survive in towns like this," Maylin answered. "It turns to rumor. You cannot protect her from what they choose to see." Her words stung because they were true. He looked toward the field where Cindy was feeding the horses, sunlight turning her hair to copper threads. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I can stand beside her while they try." That night, Cindy found her mother sitting by the lantern, sewing silently. "You scold him for helping us," she said. "Why?" "Because kindness is a dangerous debt," Maylin replied. "And because you're starting to believe you deserve it." Cindy smiled faintly. "Perhaps I do." The needle slipped in Maylin's hand, drawing a drop of blood. She watched it beat on her skin and whispered, "Pride kept us alive, not hope." The days blurred into one another. Cindy's presence at the ranch became a quiet rhythm. The sound of her sweeping, the faint hum of her voice as she worked, the rare moments when Eli caught her laughing with the stable boy. It wasn't love yet, not in words, but something had begun to take root in the silence between them, something as fragile and stubborn as the vines twisting up the fence posts. One afternoon, as they repaired a gate together, a windstorm swept across the valley. Dust turned the sky copper. Cindy's hat blew off, her hair whipping free. She reached for it, stumbled, and Eli's hand caught hers. Rough, warm, steady. For an instant they froze, the storm whirling around them, their eyes locked. He released her first, his voice low. "You should head inside." She didn't move. "You don't think I should be here, do you?" "I think you deserve to be anywhere you want," he said. "But the world don't always agree." Later that evening, when Maylin came to fetch her, Eli handed her a small wooden carving, a bird with open wings. "Tell her I made it," he said. "For her mother." Maylin stared at it for a long moment before taking it. "Do you know what happens to men who stand with us?" she asked. "Do you know what happens to men who don't?" he replied. That night, thunder rolled in the distance again. Cindy sat awake, tracing the carved bird's wings, feeling the grooves where his knife had lingered. She thought of his hands, gentle in strength, and the way his voice carried weight without force. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with rain and red blossoms drifting across an endless prairie. By the end of summer, the gossip reached a breaking point. At the saloon, a drunk rancher named Pike boasted that he'd offer money for the little foreign girls' company. When Eli heard, he rode into town before dawn. The door to the saloon burst open under his boot. Inside, Pike sat at a table, nursing his hangover. Eli didn't shout. He simply took hold of the man's collar and slammed him against the post hard enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar. "You speak her name again," he said, his voice a blade, "and I'll forget I was raised polite." Pike spat blood but didn't answer. No one intervened. When Eli left, the room stayed silent long after the door closed. Back at the ranch, Cindy was waiting by the fence, unaware of what had happened. He didn't tell her. Instead, he said, "It's a fine day for riding. You ever been past the creek?" She shook her head. He saddled a mare for her, adjusted the stirrups, his hands careful not to brush hers. They rode through wildflowers and sunlight until the world felt unjudging again. She laughed as the horse trotted faster, her braid flying, and for a brief hour, the valley forgot its cruelty. When they returned, Maylin stood on the porch, her expression unreadable. "You look happy," she said to her daughter. "That frightens me." Eli tipped his hat and left before she could speak further. That evening the wind shifted. The first cold scent of autumn arrived early, carrying whispers of change. Maylin watched her daughter hang laundry at sunset, the colors of the cloth glowing gold, and something inside her softened. Perhaps kindness wasn't always a trap. Perhaps some men meant what they said. Yet fear lingered. After Cindy went inside, Maylin unfolded the bird carving, tracing the wings until her fingers trembled. Then she looked toward the horizon, where the Boone Ranch lantern flickered faintly in the dusk. "He doesn't know what the town will do," she murmured. But Eli did know. He saw it in every stare, every silence that followed him. Still, when he looked across the field the next morning and saw Cindy kneeling in the dirt, planting the last of the wildflower seeds, he made his decision. He would no longer let decency be mistaken for hesitation. As he turned to fetch his horse, a shadow moved behind him. Tom Bray stepped from the barn doorway, face grim. "You sure you want to keep this up, Boone?" he said quietly. "You're making enemies you can't outshoot." Eli didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the Lee cabin where a wisp of smoke rose, delicate as a prayer. "I'm not aiming to outshoot anyone," he said finally. "Just to outlast them." Tom shook his head, muttering something about fools and pride. But Eli kept walking, his stride slow, deliberate, the sun at his back. By nightfall, another rumor would bloom, this one sharper than the rest, that Eli Boone had declared the Lee girl under his protection. Whether he truly said it or not, no one could agree. But by morning, every door in town would know the story. And on that quiet hill, where wildflowers had just begun to bloom, a seed far more dangerous than rumor had finally taken root. The town gathered at dusk, drawn by rumor as surely as moths to lamplight. The saloon doors swung open and shut in restless rhythm, letting in slivers of heat, laughter, and the low murmur of men who'd come to judge rather than drink. At the far end of the room stood Eli Boone, tall and silent, his hat low, his broad hands folded on the bar. Across from him, Pike nursed his pride and a bottle of whiskey. The air felt thick enough to ignite. "You think you're better than the rest of us, Boone?" Pike said finally, his voice sharp with drink. "Taking in that foreign girl like she's some saint." The words slurred, ugly, meant for spectacle. Chairs creaked. Boots shifted. Every man waited for Boone to break. Eli's gaze lifted, slow, level, steady as a drawn rifle. "Careful," he said softly. "You're speaking about someone who ain't here to defend herself." "That's right," Pike sneered. "She ain't here, but everyone knows she's under your roof. Under your name, maybe under your—" The blow came faster than thought. Eli's fist met his jaw with a sound like wood splitting. Pike crashed backward through a chair, bottle shattering beside him. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Eli spoke, his voice carrying through the room like thunder rolling over hills. "She's under my protection," he said. "And if that don't sit right with any man here, he can step outside and say so to my face." Silence answered. Outside, a gust of wind scattered dust along the street. Inside, something older than fear settled, a grudging respect, perhaps, or the uneasy weight of conscience. When Eli left, he walked home alone beneath a bruised purple sky. The stars looked distant and cold, but the lantern glow from the Lee cabin burned warm. He saw Cindy on the porch, mending a torn hem beneath her mother's watchful eye. For a moment he almost turned away, afraid his anger might still cling to him. But Maylin looked up, her face unreadable, and motioned him closer. "I heard," she said before he could speak. "The town will not forgive you for this." "Wouldn't be the first time I stood alone," he said. She studied him, searching his face for weakness. "Why?" "Because right's right," he said simply. "And I ain't about to let wolves circle your door while I've got a rifle and a conscience." Her lips tightened, not disbelief but sorrow. "You will ruin her," she whispered. "You will make her name a fire no one will touch." Eli shook his head. "I'm not the one lighting matches." Cindy rose, setting her sewing aside. Her voice was soft but sure. "Mother, he's only trying to protect." "Enough." Maylin's tone cracked like ice. "Protection is just another chain when a woman cannot repay it." Eli stepped back as if the words themselves had weight. "I never asked for anything back," he said quietly. "Not once." But pride and fear were louder than truth. Maylin turned away, tears glinting like glass. "Go home, Mr. Boone. Before the town decides to make you pay for our shame." He left without another word. The door closed softly behind him, but the echo of his boots lingered like the memory of thunder after a storm. That night, the valley slept uneasily. The moon hid behind clouds, and the wind carried the faint scent of smoke. By dawn, it wasn't the smell of rain that woke them, it was the acrid bite of fire. Cindy screamed first. Flames clawed up the side of their cabin, devouring dry boards, turning years of hardship into an inferno of orange light. Maylin coughed, clutching a soaked blanket, but the fire leapt faster than breath. "Get out," she cried. "Take the photo box." Cindy stumbled through the door just as the roof groaned. The world blurred, heat, smoke, cracking timbers. Then a shadow burst through the haze, Eli bareheaded, soaked from the creek, his coat wrapped around his arm. "Where's your mother?" he shouted. "In there." Cindy gasped. He plunged through the doorway before she could stop him. The smoke swallowed him whole. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then he emerged again, half carrying, half dragging Maylin, her hair singed, her face blackened with soot. Behind them, the roof caved in with a roar. The fire lit the sky like a second sunrise. They collapsed on the grass, coughing, the rain beginning to fall as if the heavens themselves were ashamed of their silence. Cindy clung to her mother, sobbing, while Eli poured water from his canteen over the smoldering remains. Maylin's eyes fluttered open. For a long time she said nothing. Then, hoarse and trembling, she whispered, "Why?" Eli met her gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do." She turned her face away, tears mixing with ash. "You'll destroy yourself for us." "Maybe," he said. "But I'd rather burn honest than live safe in the dark." When the last embers died, dawn broke pale and cold. The cabin was nothing but ruin, blackened beams, a few warped utensils glinting among the ashes. Maylin tried to rise but faltered. Eli helped her gently to her feet. For the first time she didn't pull away. They stood together in silence as rain hissed over the wreckage. Cindy wept quietly, her hands covered in soot. Eli took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She looked up at him through tears, and something in her gaze made him stop breathing. Not gratitude, something deeper, something older than fear. Behind them, the town gathered at the edge of the field, drawn by smoke and spectacle. Mrs. Hawthorne gasped when she saw them alive. Tom Bray muttered, "Damn fools, nearly died." No one offered help. No one spoke apology. They simply watched, uncertain whether they were witnessing tragedy or defiance. Eli turned toward them, his eyes fierce in the morning light. "You can stare all you want," he called out. "But a man's worth ain't measured by your gossip." His voice carried like a bell through fog. Some looked away. Others shifted uneasily. Mrs. Hawthorne crossed herself. The crowd dispersed one by one until only rain remained. When it was over, Maylin knelt beside the ashes of her sewing chest. Inside the charred remains, she found the small wooden bird Eli had carved. Its wings were blackened but intact. She held it carefully as if afraid it might crumble. "It survived," she murmured. "Some things do," Eli said. She looked up at him then, truly looked, and in that gaze lay the first faint shimmer of surrender. Not of defeat but of faith. "You said she was under your protection," Maylin whispered. "Do you still mean it?" Eli nodded. "Till the day I can't stand." The rain thickened, drumming against the earth. Maylin turned toward her daughter, who knelt amid the wreckage, eyes wide with grief and something more. "Maybe," Maylin said softly, "you see her as more than my daughter now." Eli's voice caught. "Ma'am, I see her as herself." The words hung between them, trembling with unspoken promise. Maylin bowed her head, not in defeat but in peace. "Then you may rebuild," she said quietly. "Not just the house. Whatever comes next." He nodded once, throat tight. The rain slowed, sunlight piercing through clouds like mercy. The valley shimmered, wet earth, smoke and the fragile scent of renewal. Cindy rose slowly, her face streaked with tears and ash. Eli met her halfway, neither speaking. He reached out and brushed a soot mark from her cheek. Her eyes closed and for a breath time stopped. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint laughter of children from the distant town, a sound too innocent to belong to such a place. The three of them stood together in the rain, framed by ruin, but something invisible had changed. The world that had conspired to shame them could no longer touch what had been forged in fire. As the last drops fell, Maylin whispered to the sky, half prayer, half surrender. Perhaps the ancestors sent the fire to test what deserved to endure. Eli looked at her, then at Cindy. "Then I reckon we passed." Beyond them, smoke curled upward like a ghost returning home. The river nearby swelled with rainwater, carrying the ashes of what was lost toward the open plains. And from those ashes, something quiet but unstoppable began to stir, a promise unspoken but alive. When the wind finally died, the only sound left was the steady drip of water from the eaves of Eli's barn and the faint rhythmic beat of a hammer striking wood as he began to build again. Somewhere inside the new silence, honor had spoken, and it would never be silent again. Spring returned as if nothing had burned. The hills were soft again, dotted with wildflowers that hid the scars of ash beneath them. The Lee women had moved into a small room at Eli's ranch while the new cabin rose plank by plank beside the orchard. From dawn till dusk, the sound of hammering blended with birdsong, the music of rebuilding. Yet beneath the quiet industry ran a pulse of something neither Eli nor Cindy could name, a trembling awareness that filled every silence between them. Maylin watched from the porch, her hands busy with mending, her heart not at ease. She had come to accept Eli's kindness, even his courage, but she feared the storm that followed love in a world built on judgment. Still she said nothing. Some truths needed to grow in secret, like seeds pushing through earth after a fire. One evening, as dusk fell gold over the fields, Cindy brought supper to the men. Eli was working alone by the barn, sleeves rolled, arms dusted with sawdust. She set the bowl of rice and beans beside him and stood there, waiting. The air was warm, humming with crickets. He looked up, his face softened by the amber light. "You didn't have to bring that yourself," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. Her English had grown steadier, her voice less shy. "Mother says you work too late." He smiled faintly. "Your mother's right about most things." Cindy hesitated, her fingers tightening around her skirt. "She says, people in town still talk. They always will." He wiped his hands on a cloth, eyes steady on hers. "Talk don't change what's right." "But it hurts," she whispered, "when they look at me that way. Like I stole something I didn't mean to touch." Eli leaned back against the beam, his voice low. "They're scared of anything they can't own or explain. But you," he paused, searching for the right words, "you make the world quiet just by standing in it." The silence that followed was fragile and full. She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth trembled with the beginning of a smile. That night, after she left, he found the handkerchief again in his coat pocket, the one embroidered with plum blossoms. The edges were worn from his fingers. He folded it carefully, tucking it inside his vest as though keeping a secret close to his heart. The next day the town came calling. Tom Bray arrived first, hat in hand, his voice low with warning. "Boone," he said, "you've got to think about what you're doing. Folks say you're fixing to marry that girl. If you do, they'll shut you out for good. No one'll trade, no one'll hire." Eli looked up from the post he was setting. "Then I reckon I'll live on what I can grow." Tom sighed. "It ain't that simple." "It is," Eli said, his voice like iron beneath calm. "I ain't marrying to please the town." When Tom left, he carried the story straight to Mrs. Hawthorne's porch. By sundown, the rumor had reached every ear. Eli Boone was going to wed the Chinese girl. Some laughed, some spat, some crossed themselves. And through it all, Maylin sat by the fire that evening, silent as stone. "Is it true?" she asked when Eli came in to bring more wood. He met her gaze without flinching. "Not yet," he said. "But I mean for it to be." The air thickened between them. "You would shame yourself for us?" she asked. "No," he said softly. "For once, I'd stop letting others decide what's shame and what ain't." Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. For a long time she said nothing. Then very quietly she answered, "You'll speak to her then?" The next morning dawned clear and cool. The fields glittered with dew, and the half-built cabin stood like a promise against the blue sky. Cindy was hanging laundry when Eli walked up the hill. She turned, startled, a sheet fluttering between them like a veil. "You came early," she said. "I needed to talk to you," he said. His voice carried a gravity that made her heartbeat quicken. He stopped a few paces away, the wind stirring his hair, his hat in his hands. "You remember when your mother said no one would marry you here?" Her breath caught. "I remember." Eli nodded slowly. She was right. No one in this town would. But I wasn't asking anyone else. The words hung there, simple, steady, undeniable. The breeze tugged the hanging cloth aside, and their eyes met fully for the first time without fear or hesitation. Tears welled before she could speak. "You would do that?" she whispered. "I already have," he said. "In my heart it's done." Her hand went to her mouth, trembling. "My mother knows," he said. And she didn't say no. Cindy turned away, her breath unsteady, the world blurring around her. She had imagined love as something distant, impossible for someone like her, something the West would never allow. But here it stood, gentle and certain, asking nothing but truth. When she faced him again, her cheeks were wet. "Then I will say yes," she said. "Not for rescue. For peace." He stepped closer, slow as sunrise. "That's all I ever hoped to give." Below them, the valley shimmered in morning light. The orchard trees bloomed again, the petals drifting like snow. From the porch, Maylin watched, her hand pressed to her heart. When Cindy ran to her, she rose without a word and folded her daughter into her arms. "You chose with your own courage," she whispered. "That's all I ever wanted." The wedding came quietly 2 weeks later. No preacher from town, no guests but the wind and the mountain. Eli built an arch from the branches of the cherry trees that had survived the fire. Malin sewed Cindy's dress from white linen and silk scraps saved from their journey across the ocean. When Eli took her hands beneath that arch, sunlight poured through the clouds like blessing. "I don't have fine words," he said softly, "but I'll spend the rest of my life proving this ain't a mistake." She smiled through tears. "Then I'll spend mine believing you." They exchanged no rings, only the handkerchief, folded once more, tied gently around both their hands. When it fell away, the wind carried it toward the orchard, where it landed among new blossoms. Malin watched it drift and felt a peace she hadn't known in years. As evening settled, the sky turned rose and gold. Music rose from somewhere unseen, a harmonica, faint and wandering. The townsfolk watched from afar, some in silence, some in quiet shame. Mrs. Hawthorne turned away first, muttering that spring had gone mad. But a few others lingered, unsure whether what they saw was sin or grace. When the last light faded, Malin stood beside Eli and Cindy at the cabin's threshold. The air smelled of sawdust and lilac. "This land will forget," she said softly, looking toward town. "But we won't." Eli nodded. "Let it forget. We'll remember enough for all of them." Cindy took his hand, her smile faint but steady. Together they stepped inside, the door closing on the noise of the world. Outside, the orchard whispered in the dark, petals falling over the graves of rumor and fear. The moon rose full and white above the valley, and for the first time since they'd come to this harsh land, the night felt like home. And somewhere in the distance, as if carried by wind itself, an old voice, perhaps the storyteller's, spoke softly to the heart of whoever still listened. "Remember this, traveler. Love does not ask permission to exist. It grows in burned fields, it sings through broken walls, and it finds its way to bloom again when spring returns."